Welcome to the Get Fit Guys quick and dirty tips to slim down and shape up. And today we're going to talk about whether or not weightlifting is bad for your heart. Now, I want you to do something. Hold your breath. Now, try and make a giant oomph sound without actually letting go of your breath. You'll feel lots of pressure build up inside you as you do this. The Valsalva maneuver is the term given to this action of creating lots of internal pressure by trying to breathe out against a closed epiglottis, which is the fancy anatomical word for that flap that opens and closes your esophagus. Now, you may also be familiar with the Valsalva maneuver as something that you might do when you pinch your nose shut and try to equalize pressure when you dive deep underwater in the pool or the ocean, or something you do on a plane to try and equalize pressure in your ears. But often, even if you do it by accident, you perform the Valsalva maneuver when you're lifting weights. Now, based on the fact that this Valsalva maneuver can increase internal pressure, there is a prevailing belief that the same type of oomph sound you make during weightlifting increases your blood pressure and may actually make you more prone to a heart attack if you have heart problems. But is it a misconception that weightlifting raises blood pressure, or should you really steer clear of the weights if you have heart issues or high blood pressure? Well, you're about to find out. Let's start with a quick introduction to what blood pressure actually is. Now, the Quick and Dirty Tips House Called Doctor has a great episode about blood pressure that I'll link to in the show notes. But basically, blood pressure is a measure of the pressure exerted by circulating blood on the walls of your blood vessels as blood is pumped through your body. The pump, of course, in this case is your heart, and the heart is this hollow muscle that squeezes blood out to your body. There's two chambers in the heart called ventricles that do the pumping. You have your right ventricle, which pumps blood to your lungs so that the blood can get oxygen, and then your left ventricle, which pumps that oxygenated blood to the rest of your body. Now, there are two parts of this whole pumping cycle. The part where your heart relaxes and fills up with blood. That's called diastole. And then you have the part where your heart squeezes blood out to your body, and that's called systole. Now, the two parts of the heart's pumping cycle are important to know because they coincide with two important blood pressure numbers. You have your systolic pressure, which happens when your heart squeezes or when systole happens, and you have your diastolic pressure. And no surprises here, that's the part where your heart relaxes and fills, the diastolic phase. So when you're wearing a blood pressure cuff and someone is sitting there listening with a stethoscope to your blood pressure, they're going to hear a certain point where the pressure gets highest. And at that point, it sounds like a thunk, and that's your systolic pressure. And the lowest pressure in the cycle, or the diastolic pressure, is signified when that thunk sound the person is hearing tends to go away. Now, blood pressure is usually measured on your upper arm, and it's a measure of the pressure in your brachial artery, the major artery in your upper arm. Your blood pressure is usually expressed as your systolic pressure over your diastolic pressure, and that's measured in what are called millimeters of mercury. For example, a blood pressure of 120 over 80 refers to 120 as your systolic blood pressure and 80 as your diastolic blood pressure. So, let's get into whether or not weightlifting increases your blood pressure. Most studies that investigate the relationship between exercise and blood pressure measure the actual resistance in the blood vessels themselves, like that brachial artery in your arm, but they don't actually measure the pressure in your heart. Now, the pressure in your vessels, like that brachial artery, is called your peripheral resistance, and the pressure in your heart is called your central resistance. This is important to know because it's actually the stress that your heart is exposed to during exercise that you should be worried about if you're worried about something like a heart attack while weightlifting. And it turns out that even though your peripheral resistance goes up during exercise, especially when you hold your breath with something like a Valsalva maneuver, studies that measure central resistance, or the pressure in your heart, have found that the actual pressure in your heart doesn't get significantly elevated above resting values. Now, you'd have to actually feed a tube called a catheter into your heart or use special equipment called an echocardiogram to measure something like this. So it's no surprise that most personal training manuals tell personal trainers to simply measure blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff on your arm. But it turns out that even if that blood pressure number is high while you're weightlifting, it doesn't necessarily mean that your heart is getting too stressed. Now, it's also important to understand that your blood vessels can change their size and thus affect the resistance that your heart has to pump against. Here's how it works. One way that your body increases blood flow and cardiac output during exercise is by dilating your arteries, meaning making them bigger. And this actually decreases the resistance, that peripheral resistance that your heart pumps against. And for a long time, exercise scientists believe that cardiac output somehow decreases during weight training because contracting muscles squeeze those blood vessels and make them shrink, which would increase peripheral resistance and dangerously raise blood pressure. Thus, it was assumed, and is still assumed by many exercise professionals and doctors, that weightlifting is not safe for people with heart disease because it puts too much stress on your heart. But when you lift a heavy weight, you also produce something called adrenaline. And adrenaline causes the arteries in your muscles to dilate or get bigger. And this causes a decrease in peripheral resistance, an increase in cardiac output, and no change in blood pressure that's dangerous to your heart. As a matter of fact, the squeezing action of contracting muscles actually milks blood back to your heart. This means that for people with high blood pressure, lifting weights may actually be less stressful to the heart than aerobic exercise, like running, which doesn't result in that same milking action of the muscles to as significant an extent. Now, in the show notes, I'll be sure to include some reference articles that show that weightlifting is completely safe and even beneficial for those with cardiac disease. Those show notes are going to be over at getfitguy.quickanddirtytips.com. So ultimately, don't be shy about heading to the gym and lifting heavy stuff. It'll do your heart good. But if you have more questions about whether weightlifting is bad for your blood pressure, or if you have other concerns about weight training, then you can head over to facebook.com/getfitguy and ask your questions there. And while you're over at facebook.com/getfitguy, check out the brand new 12-week belly burner project that Mighty Mommy and I are doing. And even though we launched this project a couple weeks ago, you can jump in at any time. It's 12 weeks of workouts and nutrition designed to maximize fat loss without really causing you to have to spend your life at the gym. It's designed, for example, for busy parents with children who want to burn fat fast. Now, if you go over to facebook.com/getfitguy, you can grab the same 12-week plan that Mighty Mommy is following, and also by staying tuned to that page, you can know each month when I'm doing a live workshop to answer all your fat loss questions. And these live workshops are fun video sessions with me and the Mighty Mommy. So check that out over at facebook.com/getfitguy. And until next time, I'm Ben Greenfield, the Get Fit Guy, asking you, what are you waiting for? Go get fit.